So I asked the question in the pre-announced video of what is your routine in the morning, coffee, tea, or water? I saw some water. I saw some coffee. I don't think we had any tea drinkers yet put any comments. And I'm pretty sure some of you are going, where is the Diet Coke or Red Bull option? But I didn't want to expose anybody to admitting that first thing in the morning. You know, I've tried all kinds of different things. This year, I'm trying to lay back off the coffee a little bit. Actually, just caffeine. I drink cold coffee, like iced coffee. That was the best thing ever when that came out, because to me, coffee tastes like dirt, but it's hot dirt, and it burns my mouth, and I really just want the caffeine. So the iced coffee is a faster version of dirt water, and so I just wanted the caffeine, and that's just the total truth. I drink iced coffee because it's faster. I don't enjoy it through that. But, you know, when you think about your habits in the mornings, if you skip one thing, like you forget to brush your teeth, next thing you know, you walk outside, you don't have socks on, or, you know, you forget other parts of your routine. We all have different routines like that. For me, one of the routines that I started skipping pretty early on in college was breakfast. I'm not sure if you're a breakfast eater, but I know growing up, I knew that the single most important meal of the day was breakfast. And the reason I knew that was because Tony the Tiger and other sugar cereal commercials would tell me every Saturday between commercials between my favorite cartoons. And for some reason, I believed them. I don't know why I didn't think, why would I ever think Tony the Tiger or that lucky leprechaun would, tell me anything other than the honest truth. But out of that, in college, I stopped eating breakfast. And it's not so much, it was priorities. I wanted sleep more than I wanted food. And then I would roll out of bed and make it to class in time. But out of that, over time, I just stopped eating breakfast. And I love breakfast. It's my favorite meal of the day. I will eat it for dinner. I will eat it for lunch. Biscuits and gravy all day, every day, all those kinds of things. But I just don't eat breakfast anymore. And I got into that habit a long time ago. Well, I found out a few years ago, I was looking at some of the different things about health. There's this, I had stumbled upon something called intermittent fasting. And I didn't know it, but I was already doing it. Now, we're not talking about spiritual fasting at this point. We're just talking about in the ketogenic diet, for instance, they talk a lot about this. And that's where you maybe skip a meal. So if you skip breakfast and you eat maybe the last meal of your night at 6 o'clock and then you don't eat again until noon, you put in 18 hours of intermittent fasting, which is actually a really big deal. That's a good number to shoot for. And I thought, this is great. But I wasn't getting any healthier as a result. I was just skipping breakfast. But over time, I did try that because I was already doing it. I was like something I could check off the box. Hey, I'm intermittent fasting. I never said that to anyone because I didn't want it to come across. I was taught you don't brag about fasting for whatever reason you're doing it. And I'm telling you this because it wasn't for spiritual reasons. But over time, I started doing it and following some healthy habits. And I noticed that I would look up and it'd be 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and almost it's way past lunch, and I wasn't hungry. And I just skipped lunch. And over time, I started skipping lunch. And for a season last year, I just ate one meal a day. About 23 hours a day, I just didn't eat. I would eat dinner, and then I would go back to it. And you would think, Tony, the Tiger, tells me that you can't function like that. But I did just fine on that, and I'm trying to get back to that. But here's the problem. You see, our bodies have this thing called ghrelin. It's a hormone. And when you skip a meal, it tells you that. For some of you, you come out as hungry and angry all rolled into one. Your stomach growls. You get that feeling that you need to eat. And so we're talking about fasting today, and we're going to talk about it from a spiritual perspective because that might be something that's kind of foreign to you. Growing up, I remember hearing about fasting, some in church. To fast was, the traditional sense is to skip solid foods for 24 hours. You just drink water or potentially juice, and for 24 hours, and then in breakfast, you break the fast, and that's why it was called that. And so we didn't do that much in my home church, except unless there was a crisis. Every once in a while, they'd call the whole church to fast, but they didn't tell us how. It just meant I was miserable for a day, missing out on those Frosted Flakes or whatever else was in the cabinet. But out of that, I remember in 8th grade, I was reading the Bible, and it was talking about fasting, and I told a friend, I think I want to try fasting. And he was like, no, that's a terrible idea. I was like, why? And he's like, you'll lose muscle. Now, I needed all the muscle I could get in 8th grade. I had shot up about 6 inches the year before. I was skinny as well. This was my bro friend that actually had gotten into protein way before it was a thing, and he was getting ready for football. So one day without protein was one less day to pack on some muscle. And he was the biggest dude around. And I was like, okay, well, maybe it's a bad idea to fast. And then over time, I just forgot much about it. But it's not something I've ever done naturally or normally. But it turns out when you look at Christianity over the last 2,000 years, for the majority of it, it was a natural habit of Christians to fast once or twice a week. And I thought, this is so odd to me because it's not something that was really seen as a normal part of life. And so we're in a series called Habits. And a habit is something you do almost second nature. You don't even think about it. You just do those things, whether it's a good habit or a bad habit. And we're looking at this as we're 1 month out from Easter, 4 weeks. This is the 1 year anniversary. The tornado came through. The first case of COVID was in Williamson County this week. By next week, I was going to Jody and Lonnie's basement, and we were recording songs with some of you, getting ready to go online only. A lot of things changed a year ago at this exact moment. But if we go back to what it was like back then to now, things are rolling out with vaccines. We're getting to meet again. We're going to get some normalcy. But do we want to go back to the normal we were experiencing? Were we happy with our relationships? Were they deep and strong relationships, or were they thin? Were we filled with anxiety? Were we trying to figure out how we were stretched too thin in so many ways? And so we want to look, as we open up as a church, but also in the world, how do we make sure we put in the right habits and we have the right boundaries? That's what we've been looking at, is setting some boundaries on our life so that when we get into this world, because the world's going to try to distract us and give us, like Tony the Tiger on Saturday mornings, a message that may not line up with what Jesus is calling us to. So let's look at some good habits. And they're not just habits. In the Christian life, for years and decades, it's been called spiritual disciplines. Prayer, reading the Bible, fasting, meditation, confession. These are the kinds of things. Some of those you've heard of. We do those things on a regular basis. Confession, in evangelical terms, not so much, but there's a biblical point to it. Meditation, I was always taught, we don't talk about that because in Eastern religions, they do meditation. And we lost this deep part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And all throughout the Bible, like David, where he talks about, I meditate on the law day and night. Eastern religion, meditation is about the emptying of the mind. But Christian meditation is the filling of the mind. And for many of us, we just never even heard that because we were just told we're not going to do that anymore. So we want to look at some of these and explore those. And today we're going to look at fasting. And you might think, why do I care about fasting? How does this matter to me? But here's the big premise for this whole series is we were meant for deeper things. And in the psalmist, when he calls out to God, is the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. My soul thirsts for the living God. Deep calls after deep. There is a longing and yearning for more in our life. And if we are not listening or putting ourselves in a place to hear those things, we're just going to continue to react to what the world throws at us and stay in that thin, distracted life. But the way to get to those deeper, more meaningful times with God might be through these habits, these spiritual disciplines. And that's why we're looking at those. And so this week is fasting. And so we're going to look at it from where Jesus talks about fasting, and that's Matthew chapter 6. So I invite you to turn there. This is from the Sermon on the Mount. This is where Jesus gives this amazing ethic, chapters 5 through 7, everything from, I'm not just telling you to love your neighbor, but love your enemies. Pray for them, how to pray. Chapter 6 has things like giving to the needy. He talks about the Lord's Prayer, how to pray, and then he mentions fasting, which is interesting because when you think about it, giving to the needy, if you think about what's expected of followers of Christ, giving to the needy is one of the things you help those who are in need. Praying, yep, that's definitely one of the things you follow Jesus. Fasting, that's an elective. We just add that on if you're in crisis. If you think about it, we don't put that with the everyday moments of following Jesus. And it's interesting when you look through the history of things like fasting, there was times that the Pharisees would fast 2 times a week. And we're going to talk about them in just a minute. That's exactly who Jesus is talking to. Later on, there was this writing called the Didache. Like 100 years, a century after the early apostles, you have writings that were written down of like traditions and how we do church. Because one thing, baptism had to change. You couldn't just go down to the river and have baptism because in certain places that meant the Romans gathered you up and killed you right then. So how do you baptize someone in an upper room? And they had whole rules about that. And that's how we get different forms of baptism, even starting from that time. But it talked about fasting twice a week. And John Wesley, founder of Methodism, he would not ordain a Methodist minister unless they fasted on those 2 days a week, Mondays and Wednesdays. He said, you're not going to be a part of the ministry if you don't fast twice a week. So do we have to fast? Am I about to give us a guilt trip on fasting? No, that's not where we're going with this, but I think there's some opportunity for each of us to see how fasting can actually help us. It's a posture. It's not about changing God. This is about opening ourselves up to what God wants to do in our life. And so we'll see that today. Matthew chapter 6, verse 16, he says this. He says, and when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. So during this time, the Pharisees would actually fast twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays. Turns out those were that's the market days. That's when there was a larger crowd. And so they made sure to fast and be seen by those fasting on the heaviest days of the week so that other people would be impressed. In Luke chapter 18, we see this again, where the Pharisee, a religious leader of the time, he came up and he was praying, Jesus said, and he looks at another man that was praying there, and he says, I'm glad I'm not like this sinner. And he says in Luke 18:12, I fast twice a week, and I give a tithe from everything that I make. So he was proud that he fasted twice a week. And there was this precedent set that they fasted twice a week. But look at what Jesus says. He doesn't say when you fast, it says, it doesn't say if you fast, it says when you fast. So it's not saying you must fast, but it's definitely, there's this expectation that maybe fasting was a normal part of the life of a Jewish believer in that time, following the Torah and the traditions of the time. There was an expectation there was fasting going on. They even asked Jesus one time, why don't your disciples fast like John the Baptist's disciples? And he says, and Jesus gives the example of when the bride and they're getting ready to get married and the bridegroom, they don't fast during that time. It's a time of celebration. There's a time coming when I won't be here, and then they will fast. And again, there's this expectation of fasting. So what does fasting do? How do we kind of figure this out? Well, this is about motivation at this point. Jesus says when you fast, and we'll come back to that about why should we fast. But this is about motivation. He says, don't be like them. They disfigured their faces. They made sure everybody knew they were miserable. They were hungry. They had been fasting. He says they've received their reward because they were doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. And apparently, when Jesus teaches, doing the right thing for the wrong reasons isn't enough. How many times do we do things because we think it's going to impress others instead of for the right reason because God calls us to it, it's part of who we are? He says you've received your reward. He says instead, when you fast, verse 17, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Reward. Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff, right? What does it mean to be rewarded for fasting? Okay, so we'll get there in just a second. But look at what he said. He says, don't do it so others will see you. Instead, put oil on your head. Wash your face. Don't go around acting like you're about to pass out because you've been fasting. Instead, he says, cover it up and let this be for God and God alone. And then you will have a reward. So what is the reward? Well, one of the challenges with this is some people did this to be impressing others around them. Sometimes people do things because they think this will cause God to do something for them. If I fast, God will answer my prayer. That is not grounded in biblical Christianity. But how many of us, if we think about it, think sometimes, I'll just be a good person this week and maybe God will bless me with something as a result. It's this moralistic deism that basically God is kind of disconnected with you, but if you'll do good things, he will give you good things in response. And the idea behind it is that God will, if we follow the rules and do what we're supposed to do, God will bless us financially and physically. But we're talking about fasting as a physical act for spiritual reasons. That's totally different than how many people look at it. They're looking at it for a physical reward. There's something far greater that we have. When Jesus came and brought salvation, he wasn't just physical salvation, which is what they were crying out for. He brought spiritual salvation. And how much greater is that for us to understand what Jesus actually did when he came and lived and died and rose again. So out of this, he says, when you fast, don't do it for the wrong reasons. So what are some of those things? So fasting, one way we can look at this is this runs counter to our culture. Maybe giving to the needy is a part of our culture in Christianity because we're in an affluent society, and giving costs us less than actually fasting, where we have to sacrifice something. That's one of the ideas out there, that maybe it's just because it runs counter to our culture. You should never deprive yourself of anything. Don't deny yourself. And yet Jesus says, if you want to be a follower of me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me. Now, if you take that to too far of an extreme, there was called asceticism, where people would beat themselves with whips and they would deny themselves just normal things. Martin Luther, for instance, the great reformer, he grew up seeing God like he saw his father. His father was a demanding man. He was never good enough. And by the way, if you're a father, your kids will see glimpses of God through you. So when some people hear good, good father, they don't know what that means when they sing that song. Some of us didn't have that. And to see a good, good father and who he is, that can be difficult. Martin Luther would have had a hard time with that. He would actually, in order to try to please this angry God that he saw up in heaven, he would sleep on stones outside in hopes that that would make God be impressed by him. And then one day this lightning bolt hits in his life, and it's called grace. And it changed everything for Martin Luther. And for us to understand, we're not doing this to get something from God necessarily, to get God to change. Like we talked last week in the book Celebration of Discipline, prayer doesn't change God, prayer changes us. Fasting's not here to change God. Fasting's here to change us, because when you start praying for your enemy, it changes how you see them. When you start praying the Lord's Prayer that we see here in chapter 6, it changes how you see the world. It changes what God is doing in your life. And in the same way with fasting, it's a posture of humility. We're saying, God, I need you more than I need this food. I need you more than anything else this world has to offer. And I'm going to take this time, I'm going to set aside all distractions, and I'm going to press in. And so that's part of fasting. And in the middle of that, Tony the tiger is whispering in your ear, this is a bad idea, right? Because we've been programmed for that for so long. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. I grew up hearing that. I don't know if you've heard that, but I could repeat that all day long. Some of you are like, yep, I remember that. Right in between the Smurfs and Fraggle Rock or whatever it was, we watched that and we heard that every time. And yet for thousands of years, most people didn't eat 3 square meals a day and have snacks. For thousands, just really the last 100 years did we have access to food the way we have now. Instead, there was fasting and there was feasting. When the crop would come in, there would be a lean season, then there would be a feast when the bumper crop would come in. But there were times when people, for thousands of years now, had to get up. There was no food on the table, and they still went out and plowed their field, and they did all the work around their plot of land, and they went home and they didn't die. But you think about our culture today, we think, if I just skip lunch, I'm going to pass out. I'm going to die, And really, the truth is, for most of us, if you have a health condition, let me just clarify, if you have a health condition, that might be serious for you. And if that's something that you deal with, then maybe fasting from food's not the best option. But there are other things that you can remove that are causing distractions, that you can make more room to hear from God. But in the middle of that, it turns out we can go quite a while without food. There's actually, it's called Rule of Threes. You can go 3 minutes without air. You can go 3 hours without proper shelter during harsh conditions. You can go 3 days without water, and you can go 3 weeks without food. And the reason that rule of 3 matters is you need to set your priorities. The first step is make sure you can breathe. The next step, probably get shelter, then get water, then get food. And not in any other order, because those are the rules of 3 of survival. And so there's times where people fasted in the Bible, and they fasted not just food, but water and everything. 3 days usually. There were some supernatural events, and unless God is making that clear and you're talking with biblical community and they're in agreement with you on that, that's not something we need to be jumping into. But there were times, for instance, in the book of Esther, chapter 4, Esther goes to Mordecai and says, I need all the people. The Jewish people were under a threat of annihilation, and she said, I need all the people to abstain, not just, they're going to fast, but not just from food, but from water and everything. And for 3 days they did. That's an extreme circumstance. There was extreme times when the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus encounters the risen Jesus, and he was blinded for 3 days, fasted. No water, no food, no anything. But then you find other times where the people are fasting just as a regular part of their life. It wasn't a crisis. And in the book of Acts, there's Antioch. When they arrived at Antioch, the believers were worshiping the Lord and fasting. It was just part of what they did. And the truth is, fasting is worship. We talk about this sometimes. When you look through the Bible, the word for service is the same word for worship. And that's why some translation will say worship the Lord with gladness. Some will say serve the Lord with gladness. It was the same word. They didn't really differentiate it. But many times in our culture, we think worship, oh, that's music. That's singing. Service, that's outside. That's doing something for someone else. But the truth is, all of it was worship. And for some, fasting became an act of worship where even the most mundane things during that day could be a holy moment to impress in and encounter the risen God. From washing dishes, picking up after your kids, putting data entry in at work, all of these were times. And then in the midst of that fasting, that moment when that ghrelin starts hormone starts to kick in your life, it's just a constant reminder that We don't need food right now, but we're going to press into prayer. And if you're praying for someone during a fast, one of the most powerful things is if you don't do it every day, or it's not something like intermittent fasting, but once a week, let's say you're skipping lunch on Thursdays, and in the middle of that, your body's going to be kind of conditioned to tell you you're hungry. What if every time that hunger pain hits, it's a reminder to go to prayer right then and pray for that person you're praying for? This constant reminder that Jesus said it in Matthew 4, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. He was being tempted by Satan in the wilderness because for 40 days he had been out there fasting and he was hungry, it says. One of those obvious statements. It says, and he was hungry. And it says Satan came to him and says, won't you take these stones and turn them into bread? Now, I've taken bread and turned it into stone, but never the other way around, okay? There's this supernatural shortcut that Satan wanted him to take right here. And he quotes Scripture too. Every time Jesus was tempted by Satan, by the way, he quotes Scripture. He was grounded in it. But there's another time, I believe it's in John, chapter 6 or chapter 14, it says that the disciples came to bring lunch to Jesus, and they said, you must be starving. He says, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. They're like, what are you talking about? And he says, my food is to do the will of the one who sent me, the Father. He understood that there was more to life than just food. And this is Jesus, the one we want to imitate and emulate in our life. He understood that there was more to life. The disciples did that. There was this understanding that fasting was a posture of humility, saying, I can't do this, and I am pressing into more what you have. If I don't have this, the world is not enough to fill the needs that I have. But if we allow the world to distract us long enough, we keep that thin life just going along, but not thriving. And you might be wondering, why should I fast then? It's not just for the hard times. It's not just for crisis, but there's this depth to the walk with God and seeing the world that when we cut out some distractions, and fasting is a way of posture. It's like in prayer. It's like in worship at times. Sometimes people will raise their hands to the sky, and when they're holding up their hands, for some, it's like they're reaching out for God. Other times, it's like a picture of total surrender. Sometimes there's the kneeling, and we're getting down on and prostrating ourselves before God, and pictures of surrender, pictures of humility, pictures of emptying ourselves. That's what fasting can be, is that it's a posture. Say, God, I'm open to whatever you have right now. I want you to change me. I'm not here to change God. I want him to speak to me and really move in my life. So when you look at all of this, when you try to think about this, how do I start? Well, there's plenty of websites on Google that you can look up fasting. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but a lot of people start with kind of a light meal, the last meal that you don't load up before you go into a fast, and then drink plenty of water, and then maybe you just skip one meal. If you skip breakfast, for instance, you'll get about 16 to 18 hours, depending on how you do that, and you break the fast at lunch. The reason that's kind of nice is you sleep through a lot of the hunger pains, so to speak, if you do that. If you skip dinner, you would sleep through the hardest part, and so maybe that's a place to start. But why would we do that? It's, again, we're pressing in and saying, God, I'm open to what you want to do, and I'm going to remove this out of my life, this normal function of my life, to focus in on spiritual things. And moving up to 2 meals, 24 hours, 36 hours, but not trying to turn this into 40-day fast. Next Easter is 40 days of fasting. We're not doing that, okay? We're not going to try that. We're not going to force that on anyone either. We're not going to brag on it. That's the hard part about this. It's not we're going to celebrate you for fasting later because you told me about it, so we'll be celebrating. But here's the thing. This is between you and God. That is your intrinsic reward, not so others will see you. And I really like this. There are side benefits. There are health benefits. And for a long time, I heard, fasting is bad for you. Now they're seeing the evidence. Just letting your body just kind of take inventory and remove toxins. There's all kinds of reasons that fasting is a good thing. But if that's the whole reason, Brennan Manning is the guy I think about. He wrote Ragamuffin Gospel. You might have heard a group that wrote songs under the Ragamuffin Band. There was Christian authors that were so influenced by Brennan Manning's writings, but he was so authentic. And he talks about, he grew up Catholic, and they would have Lent, and they'd give up things for 40 days leading up to Easter, and he says, I had to give up sugary drinks, but I really just wanted to lose 5 to 10 pounds over the next 40 days. He wasn't doing it for the right reason. So yeah, there's fasting for weight loss. There's fasting for different things. We're saying, I want to encourage you to, once a week for the next 4 weeks leading up to Easter, would you consider fasting through one meal and just seeing what God can do in the midst of that? Can we trust God to be bigger than that? You know, when we think about Sabbath, when we think about giving, we think about all these aspects of life, a lot of that. Think about Sabbath, to take a day off of rest. For an agrarian society, when God was telling that to his people, they were shepherds, they were farmers. To take a day off from work, to cease all work, was a hardship to them. That was one less day to plow the fields, to harvest and get everything ready. And he says, it's a hardship to you. But what we're learning is trust. Learning that God can do more in 6 days than we can do in our own power in 7. What can God do through fasting in our life? I don't fully know. I do know that when you talk to people that have done this a lot over their life, this is something I've looked at a few times. Felt pretty good because I'd been doing intermittent fasting. But I've not been doing complete fasting much because it's so foreign. So when we started this series, I was really challenged personally because it's not something I was familiar with. But here's what they say about what happens in the middle of fasting for spiritual reasons. It reveals what controls us. Anger, jealousy, bitterness, fear, those come to the surface during fasting. And then we can allow God to work through those in our life. It's not just hangry sometimes. There's more to it. And when it's brought up to the front, then God can work in us. And so I just want to encourage you through that. If you need more resources or you want to know where to start, the best step is to start light, skip a meal, drink plenty of fluids. And if you've got any blood sugar issues, that's something you need to talk to your doctor with first. But again, the whole reason, it doesn't sound like rocket science, but it's so foreign to some of us, we didn't do it. We don't even know where to start. And I think that's a travesty when you look at what early Christianity was about, what really for thousands of years Christianity was about. But this was natural. This was a habit. Not just one meal a week. It was twice a week. What could God do in the middle of us just humbling ourselves through this and seeing and seeking after him? I know the Bible tells us, you will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart. God longs for us to seek after him, and he's ready to meet us in the moment. And so maybe this is that moment for you. And so that's what I'll be praying for this week. So let's pray. God, right now, I thank you for this time. And God, I pray that anything I said about fasting or anything that was distracting, God, that they would just wash past our ears. But God, your truth, that you are enough, would sink deeply into our hearts. That everything else can fail, but we have enough in you. And so right now, I pray for those that are hurting, that are wondering if you really are enough. God, your presence would be strong in their life, and you would show them who you are. And that you would truly be enough, and they would give you glory and honor as a result in ways that others would see it and know that you are good. So right now, as we continue to worship, I pray everything done would give you glory, would give you honor, that it would rise up to you as a blessing as you sing over us as well. In Jesus' name, amen.